Thank you, Pastor Steve. I had to smile over stumbling on the word Thessalonians. The first time I served as a lector in my own church, I had a reading from Philippians. And I actually said a reading from the letter of Paul to the Filipinos.
Yes.
And later someone reminded me that Paul really got around. But I bring you greetings from the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona and from our Bishop Jennifer Redall. You would not know this, but our bishop has an 11-year-old son who recently suffered a brain bleed that left half of his body paralyzed. One of the first calls that she got after that incident was from your bishop, Bishop Hutterer, offering her prayers and support and help. And it's a symbol, I think, of how closely tied our denominations are, that we serve each other in that kind of way. In recent news, you will probably know that the once united Methodist Church is in the throes of rupture and will likely result in 2 or more denominations, which I think is very sad for Christianity. Some of us are coming together, some of us are going farther apart. But my task today is to talk to you about money. I would like to begin doing so by telling you a story of my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. By anyone's estimation, she could only be called a very poor woman. Her husband, my grandfather, died in his early 40s of a massive heart attack, leaving her with 5 children, all still in school, a small family farm, and absolutely no life insurance. It was 1931, which was before Social Security began, so she had no other means of support. My father, who was 14 at the time, tried to run the farm with my grandmother, but when it became clear that he could not do that and stay in school, she sold the farm to a relative, moved her small family to a neighboring town where there was an agricultural college. There she bought a 2-story house, crammed her 5 kids into 2 small downstairs bedrooms, and she herself slept on a sofa, so that she could open the upstairs as a boarding house for young men studying at the college. It wasn't long before it became clear that the income from the boarding house itself would not be sufficient, so she also then took a job working in a thrift store operated by her church. Part of her work there was to separate donated clothing into 2 piles, that which she could mend and prepare for resale, and the other pile were those that were considered rags. And from that pile of rags, she was allowed to take home with her the heavier fabrics, and she would spend her evenings cutting those fabrics into strips of cloth that were then braided to be woven into braided rag rugs that could be sold for additional income. She was a woman who knew how to sacrifice, and she sacrificed a lot in her life. She was also a very generous woman, and a woman from whom I learned a great deal, although she died when I was just 7 years old. But she had a quirky habit that she developed over the years, and that is that when she got home from her job at the store, and after she had fed the boarders and her kids and put her own kids to bed, she would take her billfold to the kitchen sink, and there, under hot, soapy water, she would take each bill and wash it between her hands, then place it on the ironing board that was always set up in her kitchen. And she would iron it until it was crisp and clean and looked new again. Now, one evening, as I was being watched by my grandmother, I was probably just 5 or 6 years old. And of course, my curiosity got the best of me, and I said, "Grandma, why do you wash your money?" And she picked up a bill that she had just ironed, and she held it up. She sat down at the table with me, and she said, "Clyde, I have come to learn in my life that every dollar I have ever received has come to me as a gift from God. And when I give these dollars to others, whether it be to the couple that runs the grocery store on the corner, or to the church, or to the man who sometimes knocks at my back screen door asking for money, those dollars become gifts to someone else. And every dollar we give, every gift we give, should be made to look as nice as it can possibly be. I learned a lot about life from my grandmother in that moment. I have spent most of my adult life working in the nonprofit sector, raising dollars for organizations and churches that need those dollars. Raising dollars that are, frankly, gifts from God. In my own congregation, I teach a 4-year study program, the first year of which focuses on the Hebrew Scripture, or what we have in the past called the Old Testament. In the Hebrew Scripture, there are many references to God telling the people to make offering, to make sacrifice. And I sometimes stumble on those words because they seem to be synonyms. But if I think about them, if we think about them, quickly realize they're not. An offering can be anything. Sacrifice. When we make sacrifice, it requires giving up something that's dear to us. And the people weren't called just to make offering, they were called to sacrifice. Sacrifice is something that we determine internally. It's something that affects us personally. The offering is just the outward manifestation of that sacrifice. We are called to sacrifice. I often imagine a young Hebrew man, the time of the patriarchs, being commanded to sacrifice, looking out over the small herd of cattle that he might have been raising, selecting the most perfect calf, tying a rope around its neck, leading it into the village, taking it to the priest where it is ritually slaughtered, placed on an altar, and burned. And I have to imagine what was going through his head. He might have been thinking, that calf was perfect. It might have become the head of a bloodline that would have made me a wealthy man. Or maybe he was thinking that the meat from that calf could have fed my family, our extended family, and our neighbors for many days. Or perhaps he was thinking the hide from that calf could have been used to make new sandals for my children. But he was commanded to sacrifice, and he sacrificed. And the reason he did so was simply because God had commanded it. And why would God command such a sacrifice? Simply because in giving up something that is really dear to us, it humbles us and brings us into closer relationship with God. Fast forward 500 or 600 years to the time of Jesus. Jesus told people they didn't need to be offering animals in the temple anymore. Why was that? Times have changed. In the times of the patriarchs, those cattle and goats and wheat from their fields, those were the currency of the day. But in the time of Jesus, they had something new. They had money. Those Roman coins were everywhere. And Jesus realized that the animals being offered as sacrifice in the temple weren't cutting it anymore. That something had become much more valuable to the people. It was that money. So Jesus tells us in Matthew 6, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. And where did he want our hearts to be? He wanted them to be placed squarely with God. How do you place your heart with God? By giving your treasure to God. If we fast forward again to the 20th century, the late Billy Graham in his sermons was famous for saying, "Show me your check register, and I will be able to tell you what it is you worship." Where our treasures are, there our hearts will be also. I was sharing that story a few years ago in another congregation, and a woman came up to me afterwards. She said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "For many years, my husband and I would go out to dinner to celebrate our anniversary and our birthdays, and it was so special, and we looked forward to it. But now that our kids are grown and out of the house, we go out to dinner 2 or 3 times a week." She said, "You know, it doesn't feel special anymore." But she said, "I also realized that if you were to look at our credit card statement, you would think we worshiped food." She said, my husband couldn't be here today, but right after this service, I'm going home to talk to him about our priorities. And I promise you, we're going to cook dinner tonight." She got it. She understood that where her treasure was, her heart would follow. She realized her heart needed to be with God. I want to share with you that many of our churches have been lying to us. They've lied to us every time they've told us that Christian stewardship was about the church's budget. They've lied to us every time they've asked us each to individually do our fair share, whatever that means. Christian stewardship has virtually nothing to do with the church's budget. Although, if we're all doing stewardship the way God has commanded us to do in a sacrificial manner, the church's budget will be one of the happy beneficiaries of that. But that's not the reason we do it. We do it to bring us closer to God, purely and simply. Purely and simply. Next week, as I understand it, you're going to be asked to bring completed pledge forms to church. You're going to be asked to bring them forward and place them directly on this altar. As you do so, I ask you to think about that ancient Hebrew man leading that calf to the altar to be burned. Now, I don't pretend for 1 minute that God wanted burnt stuff any more than God needs our money. God needs our heart. And Jesus told us very clearly that our treasure, where our treasure is, our heart will follow. So whatever rationale we have used in the past for making pledges to the church, and for many of us that's starting with, well, what did I give last year and can I increase it a little bit, or some question like that that frankly is irrelevant. The question we should be asking is, what is God calling me to give? What sacrifice is God calling me to make? And I know that not everyone pledges, and that's a shame. That's a shame. When we give on a week-to-week basis without making a pledge, that's kind of like making an offering, not a sacrifice. But having to place an amount on a pledge form and commit to God that we are willing to sacrifice that amount gets closer to making the kind of sacrifice we are called to give. Now, I know when you look at that pledge form, it's going to say, payable by December 31st of 2020. And for some of us, we might not be here on December 31st of 2020 because we live here part of the year. Or we've never pledged before and we're not comfortable making a 12-month commitment. So cross that date out. Write in the date that works for you. But make the commitment. Show God and show this congregation that you are willing to make a sacrifice in order to bring your heart closer to where it should be. So this year, I hope all of us can not just pledge, but pledge sacrificially and make that commitment to the church and to the God we love. Amen.
I didn't hear that one.
I didn't hear that either. I thought Episcopalians were bad. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.